He has made films that made the world uncomfortable. That was always the point. When Mel Gibson spent 12 years preparing The Passion of the Christ, the studios told him nobody wanted to see it. They told him the subject matter was too divisive, the approach too extreme, the commitment to historical and linguistic authenticity too uncompromising for a mainstream audience that had been trained to receive its religious content pre-softened, pre-packaged, and carefully stripped of anything that might actually disturb the comfortable distance between a viewer in a theater seat and the reality of what they were watching. He ignored them. He spent $30 million of his own money. He filmed in Aramaic and Latin with no major stars and no studio backing and no safety net. And then the film made $600 million worldwide and became one of the most culturally significant pieces of cinema ever made. Not because it confirmed what people already believed, but because it confronted them with a version of the story that felt, for perhaps the first time in their lives, physically and historically and emotionally real. Now he is preparing the sequel, The Resurrection of the Christ. And the research he has been doing for that film has led him somewhere that the studios, the critics, the theological establishment, and the cultural commentators who have spent 2 decades trying to categorize and contain his work were not expecting him to go. It has led him to the Ethiopian Bible. And what he found there, what the Ethiopian tradition has preserved for 1,700 years, while the Western world was building its carefully managed version of the faith, is a portrait of Jesus that is so different from the one most people carry in their heads that encountering it for the first time feels less like learning something new and more like remembering something you somehow already knew and had been waiting, without realizing it, for someone to finally say out loud, "This is that portrait." And once you see it, you will understand why Gibson cannot stop talking about it, and you will understand why certain very powerful institutions have spent a very long time making sure you never encountered it. The Ethiopia that most of the Western world pictures is not the Ethiopia that actually exists. The Western imagination tends to reach for images of crisis, famine, poverty, the dramatic landscapes of a continent that Europe spent centuries treating as a resource rather than a civilization. What the Western imagination does not reach for, what its education systems have systematically undertaught and its cultural narratives have consistently overlooked, is the fact that Ethiopia is home to one of the oldest, most sophisticated, and most independently developed Christian civilizations on the planet. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its origins not to a missionary journey from Rome, not to a colonial imposition of European faith, but to the 4th century, when a young Syrian scholar named Frumentius brought the faith to the Aksumite Empire and the king converted, making Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in the world. Before there was a Catholic Church in any institutional sense, before Constantinople became the center of Eastern Christianity, before the great councils that standardized doctrine and canon and practice for the rest of the tradition, Ethiopia was already Christian, already developing its own theology, its own liturgy, its own scriptural canon, already building the foundation of a faith tradition so old and so deeply rooted that 1,700 years of subsequent history, including the periods when the rest of the Christian world was actively trying to suppress or marginalize it, could not dislodge it. And that tradition preserved a Bible. 81 books, 15 more than the Catholic canon, 26 more than the Protestant, books that were present in the earliest Christian communities, that were read and referenced and taken seriously by the people who were still alive when the events described in the New Testament were living memory, and that were quietly removed from the standardized canon when Rome decided which version of the faith would be official and which versions would not. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, texts that were not excluded because they were considered false. They were excluded because they were considered dangerous, because they described a Jesus and a faith that did not fit cleanly inside the institutional structures that were being built around his name. Gibson understands this history with the specific depth of a person who has spent decades thinking about it, rather than the general familiarity of someone who encountered it recently. His engagement with pre-Nicene Christianity, with the Christianity that existed before empire got hold of it and shaped it into something more governable, goes back to his preparation for the Passion. He has said in interviews that what he found in his research for that film, the gap between the raw reality of who Jesus was and what he taught and the managed institutional version of that reality that most of the world has inherited, never left him. It is the gap that drives the resurrection of the Christ. It is the gap that the Ethiopian texts speak directly into. And it is the gap that produces the portrait of Jesus that Gibson has been describing to the people around him as the most important discovery of his research. The Jesus of the Ethiopian Bible is not the Jesus of the stained glass windows. He is not the gentle, serene, slightly otherworldly figure that Western Christian art has been producing for 15 centuries, the figure floating above the mess and pain of ordinary human experience in a way that makes him beautiful and unthreatening, and ultimately, for many people, not quite real. The Ethiopian tradition, drawing on texts that were preserved before the aesthetic and theological sensibilities of the medieval West got their hands on the tradition, presents a Jesus who is fully, almost aggressively present in the physical and emotional reality of the world he moved through. The Book of Enoch, which the Ethiopian canon includes, and which shaped the theological world that Jesus was born into, presents a cosmic framework so large and so detailed that reading it alongside the Gospels is like suddenly seeing a building's structural skeleton after years of looking only at the painted walls. The Son of Man figure in Enoch is not a gentle shepherd. He is a cosmic judge and transformer, a figure who stands at the intersection of the human and the divine, not as a passive bridge, but as an active force. Someone who sees the structure of reality as it actually is, rather than as human beings have convinced themselves it is, and whose presence in the world is consequently as disruptive as it is illuminating. When Jesus uses this title for himself, when he says, "The Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, has no place to lay his head, will come in glory, is Lord of the Sabbath," he is drawing on a specific and fully developed theological tradition that his first-century Jewish audiences would have immediately recognized, a tradition that the Ethiopian canon preserves, and that the Western canon, without Enoch, has always left viewers of the gospel texts without the context to fully understand. The Book of Jubilees fills in the Genesis narrative with a richness that changes how you understand the world Jesus was born into. The theological universe of Jubilees is one in which sacred time is not simply linear, but structured, in which the relationship between the human and the divine is governed by patterns that repeat across history, in which the covenant between God and humanity is not a single past event, but a living, recurring reality that each generation has to choose to inhabit or abandon. This is the cosmological background against which Jesus' ministry makes its fullest sense. He is not appearing from nowhere into a theologically empty world and introducing entirely new concepts. He is standing inside a tradition of immense depth and complexity and pushing it from within toward a completion that the tradition's own internal logic had always been moving toward. You cannot see that without Jubilees. The Ethiopian tradition never lost sight of it. And then there is the Book of the Covenant, the text that records, in greater detail than anything in the Western canon, the teachings of those 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. The days that the Gospels cover with a sparseness so striking it reads almost like a placeholder, a note that says, "Something happened here that we are not fully telling you." The Ethiopian tradition says those days were not a gentle postscript. They were an intensive, the most concentrated and urgent teaching of the entire ministry, delivered by someone who had just passed through death and returned with a completeness of understanding that even 3 years of ministry had not fully expressed. The Jesus that emerges from the 40-day teachings in the Book of the Covenant is a teacher in the fullest possible sense of that word, not as a title of professional respect, but as a description of a person whose central activity and deepest joy is the transmission of understanding from one mind to another. He teaches the way that people who are genuinely great at teaching teach, which is to say, not by delivering pre-formed conclusions, but by creating the conditions in which the person being taught can arrive at understanding themselves, by asking questions that open rather than close, by demonstrating through his own way of being in the world the reality he is trying to describe in words. He is, in the Ethiopian texts, deeply interested in the interior lives of the people around him, not in a therapeutic modern psychology sense, in the sense of a person who can perceive what is actually happening inside someone else and cares about it, enough to address it directly, sometimes gently, sometimes with a sharpness that surprises people who are used to the managed, softened version of his personality that most of the tradition has presented. He is also, in the Ethiopian tradition, a man who laughs. This is not a minor detail. The Western artistic and theological tradition has almost entirely expunged laughter from its portrait of Jesus, producing a figure so relentlessly solemn that the idea of him laughing feels almost theologically incorrect to many people who have grown up inside that tradition. But the Ethiopian texts include moments of genuine humor, of the specific quality of lightness that belongs to people who have seen through the pretensions and anxieties that make most human interactions heavy, who are not burdened by the need to be taken seriously because they are completely secure in what they know, and whose laughter is consequently not a relief from seriousness, but a deeper form of it. The Jesus who can laugh at the absurdity of human self-importance while simultaneously feeling the full weight of human suffering is a more complete human being than the eternally grave figure of the Western tradition. He is also, for many people who encounter this portrait for the first time, more believable, more real, more like someone who could actually change a life by being in the same room with you. Gibson has spoken about this quality in his research. He has talked about the gap between the historical Jesus and the figure that Christianity built its institutional identity around, not because the institution was lying, but because institutions inevitably domesticate the things that generate them. Because the living reality of a person is always more complex and more challenging and more irreducibly individual than any organization can fully carry forward. But because the process of turning a movement into an institution requires simplification, and simplification always costs something. And what it cost in the case of Christianity is the full humanity of the person at its center. The complexity, the humor, the anger, the moments of doubt and grief that the Gospels preserve, but that the tradition has often treated as embarrassments to be explained away rather than revelations to be inhabited. The Ethiopian Bible does not explain them away. It does not need to, because the tradition that preserved these texts was never organized around the project of making Jesus institutionally manageable. It was organized around the project of encounter, of maintaining, generation after generation, the conditions in which a genuine meeting with the living reality of this person was possible. And you cannot maintain those conditions if you have replaced the full human being with an icon. If you have substituted the managed, safe, aesthetically controlled portrait for the actual person, who made fishermen leave their boats without a second thought, and made religious authorities angry enough to kill him, and made a Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross say, with the plain directness of a man who had seen a lot of death and knew the difference, that this one was the Son of God. What Gibson is doing with the Ethiopian material is what he has always done. He is refusing the managed version. He is going back to the source and insisting on looking at what is actually there rather than the comfortable abstraction that centuries of institutional management have produced. He's asking what it actually felt like to be in the room with this person, what the specific quality of his attention felt like when it landed on you, what his voice sounded like when he was tired, when he was grieved, when he was trying to explain something important to people he loved who were still not quite getting it, what the laughter sounded like, what the silence after the laughter sounded like. These are filmmakers' questions, but they are also theological questions of the deepest kind, because the answer to them is the difference between a religion and a relationship, between a system of belief and a living encounter, between an institution and the reality the institution was built to preserve. The Ethiopian tradition has been answering these questions for 1,700 years, in stone monasteries on mountains that history largely passed by, in manuscripts copied by hand by people who were willing to give their entire lives to the work of preservation, because they understood that what they were preserving was not merely important, but irreplaceable. In a canon of scripture so much larger and so much older than the version that most of the world was given, that encountering it for the first time feels less like discovering something new and more like recognizing something that was always true and always present and always waiting for you to be ready to look at it directly. The side of Jesus that few people know is not a secret. It was never a secret. It is in the texts, the full texts, the ones that the Ethiopian tradition kept when the rest of the world was deciding what was safe to keep and what was easier to let go. It is a Jesus who is fully human and fully present and fully engaged with the difficulty and the beauty and the absolute seriousness of what it means to be alive, who laughs and grieves and argues and teaches with the specific urgency of someone who knows exactly how much time there is and what needs to be said in it, who sees people with a completeness and a directness that makes them feel, for the first time in their lives, actually seen, who is, in every account that has survived the 1,700 years of transmission, not what you expected, more than what you expected, larger and more specific and more real and more irreducibly himself than any icon or any doctrine or any institutional management of his legacy has ever fully captured. That is the Jesus the Ethiopian Bible preserved. That is the Jesus Mel Gibson has been spending years trying to bring to the screen. That is the Jesus that the Western world was given a partial portrait of and has been trying, with the partial portrait, to build a complete faith around. The complete portrait was always there, in the stone monasteries, in the hands of the monks, in the 81 books of a canon that a civilization in the mountains of East Africa decided was worth protecting at any cost, for any number of centuries, for exactly the moment when the world would finally be ready to look at it and see what was there. That moment is now, and the face looking back at you from those pages is not the one you were given. It is better than that. It is the real one.